This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome in this edition of Global Business Africa. In the next hour, we'll run through the business news stories you need to know about from the continent and beyond. But first, a quick run through the markets. This entire section is all going to be about pharmaceuticals. Sanofi, its shares are down at least 2.5% in trading in Paris today. On a year-to-date basis, they're down nearly 11%. GSK shares down 20% so far in the year. Now, this pair reported that phase 2 trial data showed that a positive response was elicited among patients in the 18 to 49 demographic, but it did trigger a low immune response in much older adults. So why does this matter if you're watching anywhere in Africa? Because between them, these two firms are not only the largest vaccine producers in the world, they're also channeling their product into the COVAX facility, which a lot of countries here in Africa have signed up to. They aim to have at least 1 billion doses or so available sometime in the second half of 2021. Here's what's coming up tonight. MTN suspends the sale of new SIM cards in Nigeria as the government embarks on an audit of subscribers. South African airlines are struggling to get back to business after COVID-19 restrictions. And the Bank of England is warning about post-Brexit financial services disruption. All that and more is in the pipeline for you tonight. But our starting point of this hour is Nigeria, where the largest single telco in the country, MTN, says it has suspended the sale and activation of new SIM cards. This comes after an order from the country's telecommunications regulator, which says it's conducting an audit of the mobile subscriber database. And this is a move that affects all mobile services providers in the country. The Nigerian Communications Commission says it has embarked on an audit of the country's subscriber registration base. This comes off the heels of a similar exercise conducted in September 2019. Nigeria is MTN's largest single market. It accounts for roughly a third of the group's entire earnings, and it looks set to grow in importance as the group pursues a strategy shift that includes focusing a lot more on African markets. MTN announced back in August that it will be exiting the Middle East altogether with the first divestment of its 75% stake in MTN Syria. Let's dig into the details of the story. Phil Ihaza joins us from the federal capital of Abuja. So, Phil, let's start with the basics here. The Communications Commission did a similar exercise last year. What does this 2020 exercise aim to achieve that last year's exercise did not?
Well, thanks, Ramah. What we know is that the SIM card registration was initiated to help tackle or curb the issue of insecurity, especially insurgency, where people can just, own more than one SIM card without proper registration or imputing their details, and tackling or finding out those criminals wherever they were or suspects was becoming an issue. And so you know that in 2015, the MTN mobile network was also fined over $5 billion because it faulted some of these protocols. And so thanks to some appeal by relevant authorities, it was brought down to $1 billion and all of that. But we know that it's now very, very important, very expedient that the Communications Commission does this on a yearly basis to audit, to ensure that all the networks are complying. Everyone is imputing their details properly. So even if it was done in 2019, it had to be done again this year to ensure that every mobile network is in check.
Indeed. So how does this, though, tie in to the wider, how does this database audit, rather, link into the January directive to Nigerian citizens to secure their digital identification records and link that to their SIM cards?
Well, the digital identification project is has been on now for 13 years, since 2007. And the government also kick-started this to see how they could change the modus operandi of database in the country, moving from analog to digital. So that's the basics. And then we've seen also that over the years, what has happened, rather than the country move to the point of having that goal of digital identification for millions, the target was 150 million, but the Commission has not even gotten to a quarter of that at the moment. What we've rather seen is the fact that we've had over 13 or more parastatals, trying to see how they can register, move to digital identification. So you want to have a new driving license, for example, you have to enter your biometrics. You want to vote, register in the Electoral Commission, you have to do your biometrics. So all of these we've seen, even registering, owning a SIM card, you have to go to the mobile network to register. And so the plan now is to unify all of this into a national identity number, which is managed by the National Identity Management Commission. So we're trying, the Commission, the government is trying to see how they can harness all of these databases as one. And so, of course, it is important that the mobile networks get this right, so that when the time for unification comes, it will be easy to transfer or interrelate with all of these agencies to see how that the database can be put together as one.
Indeed. We'll leave it there for the time being. Phil Ihaza in Abuja. Thank you. Now, on to a wider perspective on the continent. For most African economies, 2020 is likely to see the worst growth on record, and recovery in 2021 is barely even assured. So let's start with the numbers. In its latest assessment of Nigeria, the IMF is pointing out that economic output, broadly speaking, on the continent's biggest economy will likely shrink by at least 3.25%, followed by a weak recovery to 1.5% growth in 2021. In the fund's view, Nigeria's economic output may only recover to pre-pandemic levels in 2022. And remember, this is coming against a backdrop of a 3% contraction that is due to happen in 2020. The thing is, though, these numbers do gloss over some of the sheer scale of some of the social and economic problems that countries on the continent will have to deal with, as they also struggle to deal with the pandemic at the same time. According to AFDB data, roughly 9 million children, 9 million, were out of school in Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso by the end of October. As the unemployment rate more than tripled in Kenya, at least a third of rural and urban households responded by cutting meals or by selling some assets or dipping into savings, or more often than not, a combination of all those three. And that in turn has dire implications for the development of human capital and how strong and sustainable a post-pandemic recovery across the continent can really be. So then, what exactly does 2021 hold for economies right here on the continent? Let's dive into the forecast with Dr. Ramah Nyang. He's the chief economist at the African Development Bank. He joins us now from Abidjan. Dr. Ramah, thank you very much for your time this evening. So let's start with a broader picture here. As more and more countries get a lot more macroeconomic data, what is the emerging picture that you're seeing now about the continent's contraction this year and growth forecasts for 2021? Are we still on course for that 3% contraction, or might it be worse than initially forecast?
Thank you very much for having me. The continent is set to experience its first recession in about 20 years. We project minus 3.4% for 2020. And for 2021, we're still adjusting our numbers, and they'll be released in January officially. But of course, mechanically, 2021 would be higher just because we are starting from a low base. There is quite a bit of heterogeneity across the continent, with a dozen African countries experiencing a slightly positive growth.
Indeed. So let's ignore external influences for a moment. To what extent will the speed and efficiency of a vaccine rollout limit any rebounds in growth? Because if vaccines are getting to these countries at the end of 2021, I mean, surely that will stymie whatever rebound we're seeing next year, won't it?
No, absolutely. So Africa has been relatively spared by the virus, with about 54,000 deaths, which is comparable to the number we've seen in France for the whole continent. So, but of course, one life is too many, and it's critical that the vaccine be rolled out so as to give back confidence to investors, to travelers, to potential tourists coming back and doing business in the continent. So absolutely central that we roll out the vaccine and that this be done systematically.
At the start of the quarter, the forecast for resource-heavy economies, Nigeria, for instance, very heavy on oil, South Africa, big on coal and iron ore. The forecast for those guys was pretty dire since commodity prices were pretty depressed. But since Q4 started, commodity prices have been rising. Copper forwards in London, 16% higher. Brent is up 17%. Iron ore futures up nearly 30%. But in realistic terms, does that translate to a slightly easier recovery for these commodity prices, for these commodity exporters, or is that a bit too optimistic?
No, absolutely. If the rebound is firming up, and if this is more persistent, mechanically it will translate in higher growth in the commodity exporter. And I shall say, of course, that the rebound is in large part driven by recovery in China. So if the rebound in China continues, if the recovery is stronger, that would certainly sustain the recovery in commodity prices and help the commodity exporter in the continent. Yet they should also contemplate, of course, the medium run agenda of diversifying their economy and creating internal growth engine.
Indeed, even before this pandemic, though, the IMF and the World Bank, even AFDB, you'd all raised the alarm about the very limited fiscal space that a lot of economies on the continent had. But now that we're looking towards recovery, what are the options for debt relief and restructuring other than the DSSI for some of the economies that are in really, really serious debt distress?
No, absolutely. So the DSSI has provided the needed relief on the service front, on the flow of debt service. What we need to contemplate now is more on the stock. So debt cancellation and debt restructuring. This is important. The G20 has adopted a framework of comparability of treatment clauses, whereby any relief of any form on the official sector and would translate into relief in these who adopted this comparability of treatment clauses. That is also China and other private sector actors. So this framework, this new framework, will help going forward. We need to look at the details. We need to implement it. We need to be forceful, anticipate, give that debt relief early on so that we avoid debt overhang in the continent.
But how do we deal with the moral hazard problem? Because a lot of individuals in the multilateral funding space will look at this and say, okay, let's say we have some sort of debt cancellation now, some sort of debt restructuring. How are we not setting ourselves up for the same problem that we tried to solve with the HIPC initiative at least 20 years ago?
No, this issue, I think, is the most important aspect of the debt relief is to act early to avoid debt overhang. And of course, African countries should take their destiny into their own hand and address the governance issues that would be providing the kind of nexus between governance and growth. So going forward, it is really important that indeed African countries do their share and address governance issues so that they will help reignite growth. And it is through growth eventually that we will get out of debt sustainability issues.
Indeed, Dr. Ramah Nyang, Chief Economist at the African Development Bank, joining us there from Abidjan. Thank you very much. Now, a long-standing dispute between the Egyptian government and the Italian-Spanish energy consortium has been resolved, effectively allowing for the reopening of the Egyptian natural gas liquefaction plant after an 8-year closure. That move followed a protracted dispute between Union Fenosa Gas, which is a coalition of Italy's Eni and a Spanish energy company. Here's CGTN's Yasser Hakib with the details.
The deal that has been finally struck is good news for the natural gas industry in Egypt. The Damietta liquefaction plant, one of 2 in Egypt, has been shut down since 2012 due to the volatility and unrest that followed the 2011 uprising. UFG, a partnership of Italian oil giant Eni and Spain's Naturgy, had a majority stake in the plant. They went to court in 2014 for a $2 billion compensation from the Egyptian government.
The Damietta plant has a liquefaction unit that produces 5 million tons of gas every year, and that has lost revenue for years. This situation harmed Naturgy and Union Fenosa Gas financially, and that's why they sought international arbitration for contract violation and to make up for the huge losses.
The new deal entails that Eni and the Egyptian government split ownership of the LNG plant. In return for dropping the case, Naturgy will exit Egypt, taking $600 million and several UFG assets as compensation. The Damietta facility is vital for the North African country's ambitions to become a natural gas hub in the East Mediterranean.
First, Egypt will not need to import liquefied gas anymore, so it will save about $120 million a month from its budget. When the plant works on full capacity, it will create a badly needed hard currency income by exporting to the East Mediterranean and Europe. Also, when operational, the plant will create employment opportunities and help improve living conditions in the surrounding Damietta area.
The Damietta LNG plant is expected to reopen in the first quarter of 2021, consolidating Egypt's position as a main gas producer and exporter in the region. Yasser Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
All right, then a quick run through some company news. Let's start here in Kenya. Jane Kuruku has been appointed as a Group Managing Director of East African Breweries. That's majority owned by Diageo. That appointment takes effect from the 1st of January. Before that, she held the role of Managing Director of Kenya Breweries Limited, an ABL subsidiary. She'd been in that position since 2015, but she'd also been on the board of ABL from 2013. Mrs. Kuruku has more than 20 years' experience in the consumer goods industry. She worked in various leadership roles across the FMCG sector. Egypt has received a 5th train under the deal with South Korea's Hyundai Rotem to supply 32 new modernized trains for Cairo Metro's Line 3. The new trains will be equipped with an air conditioning system and a corridor that will allow passengers to move from one carriage to another while the train is in motion. They're part of a 2017 deal between the National Authority for Tunnels and Hyundai Rotem. It cost $384 million. Walt Disney has announced a pretty heavy slate of new productions for its streaming services, including Marvel and Star Wars series on Disney+, and programming from reality fan favorites, the Kardashians, for Hulu. The aggressive push coincided with news of fast growth for Disney+, which hit 86.8 million subscribers, and it nearly reached its most ambitious 2024 goal. The global COVID-19 pandemic forced consumers to essentially shelter at home and made them desperate to consume a lot more entertainment in situ. Airbnb shares more than doubled in their stock market debut, valuing the home rental firm at just over $100 billion. That essentially makes it the biggest US IPO of 2020, and it caps a bumper year in which investors flocked to tech stocks. Airbnb opened trading at $146 a share on the Nasdaq, way above the IPO price of $68 a share, and that raised $3.5 billion for the company. The stock hit a high of $165, but it closed a little bit lower, $144.71 a share. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up. South African airlines are struggling to get back to business after pandemic restrictions. And Nigeria's trade deficit peaks at a 3-year high in the third quarter. There's more to this place than just glorious landscapes. There's more to it than just, say, Table Mountain or glorious, endless salt flats. There's more to it than countries that are home to some of the deepest mines in the world. There is so much more to this place, even if it is home to some of the finest diamonds on the planet. It is the sheer diversity of the people who call Southern Africa home, and the relentless drive to make it a better place that make it so special. And we know that because this too is home. No one knows Southern Africa like we do. CGTN. See the difference. Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and Global Business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. The South African aviation industry is at the moment in a state of flux. Carriers in Africa's most industrialized economy have been forced to either go bankrupt or file for business rescue, it's a form of local administration, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. But with some of those pandemic restrictions now being lifted, CGTN's Sumitra Naidu takes a look at what airlines like the recently launched Lyft are doing to capitalize on the resurgence of air travel.
It's an important week for a number of airlines in South Africa who are getting back in the air after one of the sector's toughest years. There's even a new airline that's entering the local market.
It feels like it's always the right time to do things right, and we want to do things right in the airline industry. It's we need to be very flexible because demand is very uncertain, and we need to be able to scale up and scale down as demand dictates. But I think industries are always ready for something fresh and new.
We're much more relaxed airline, as you can see with our outfits. They wanted to go for the feel of the cabin crew being comfortable because we'll be busy. So it's a much more relaxed look.
Lyft's model is not price sensitive but based rather on the customer experience, focusing on flexibility and efficiency. But aviation experts say a price war will ensue as airlines fight to get bumps on seats.
Initially, we thought Lyft was going to compete on price. Now it seems to be competing more on flexibility and tailored product offering rather than on price. I think that Gilon Novak, the CEO of Lyft, was correct when he says he doesn't want to engage in a race to the bottom on price.
While both new and old airlines pull out all the stops to focus on South Africa's lucrative routes, old competitor South African Airways will remain grounded. Government is trying to secure a private equity partner for the state-owned entity. SAA may get back in the sky before year-end, but will have stiff competition.
The market is pretty overtraded. We've seen all the airlines with massive capacity getting back into the market, vying for market share with the new entrants like Airlink on these routes. And we're in a price war already, which is obviously very bad for airlines. It's, the prices are back to what they were pre-COVID, and yet the airlines are sitting with massively damaged balance sheets and huge debt. So we're going to see a price war for, my guess, is the next 6 to 9 months.
Former regional feeder Airlink has also entered the market, concentrating on the Golden Triangle, Cape Town, Johannesburg and East London. It's all great news for travellers, but another wave of COVID infections in South Africa could upset all of the airline's sustainability. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Nigeria's trade deficit has worsened. It's gone up to a 3-year high of about $6 billion in the third quarter of 2020. That's at least a third higher compared to the $4.7 billion recorded in Q2. That grim report by the National Bureau of Statistics is just the latest for Africa's biggest economy, which slumped into yet another recession in the third quarter after COVID-19 led a plunge in crude prices. CGTN's Kelechi Mekala filed this report from Abuja.
The latest report from the country's Bureau of Statistics puts the total trade volume for the third quarter at $21.6 billion. That's a 34% increase compared to the previous quarter. While exports stood at $7.72 billion, total import value was $13.89 billion, leaving a $6.1 billion deficit.
We are in minus 3.10%. There are many countries that are double digit and they still can't see light in the end of the tunnel. So I think with our population, with our determination to shift more towards the private sector and with excess liquidity in the private sector right now to invest, I think that we will come out of it stronger. That's not only that there is pressure on oil, which is our major commodity that gives us 90% of our forex revenue. It disrupted it, and so we lost substantial volume and also drop in price from our benchmark of $57 down to $28. But on the other hand, of course, our export was also impacted on because the disruption on the supply chain affected our industries. About 80% of our manufacturing capacity still imported their raw materials. So the disruption meant we couldn't get them in.
Nigeria's biggest impact on the balance of trade deficit has been the playoff in the oil sector. The nation's production volume dropped from 2.1 million barrels to 1.3 million barrels per day, but government has been pushing to increase non-oil exports.
We have done well last year on export of non-oil, and so those are likely to pick up sooner than later. We're struggling to keep the import down, and we're doing that with import substitution programs, and there's a lot of investment on that side. We spend over $12.5 billion importing and food-related items and all that. So there are actions to reduce the impact of. The central bank has put over 3.5 trillion on the table. The government economic sustainability plan, 2.3 trillion on the table. And we have more involvement of private sector in a way that we haven't seen before.
The value of imports in the third quarter is the highest recorded since 2017. Industry observers project that the trade may stabilize by the second quarter of 2021. But experts want to see infrastructural development, standardized production, and a boost in manufacturing, which is expected to trigger a boost in export and balance out the trade. Kelechi Emekalam, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
It just seems like yesterday, doesn't it? But 5 years ago, as you might recall, the Paris Climate Agreement was signed. And since then, several African countries have tried to play their part in tackling climate change by implementing small-scale interventions. But still, a lot more needs to be done. Earlier, we spoke to Chukwu Merije Okereke. He's a professor of global environmental and climate governance on this subject.
One of the most outstanding impacts of climate change is in the area of agriculture and food production. You see, because of Africa's location very close to the equator and being a tropical continent, Africa's temperature has been rising faster than the global mean temperature. And the consequence of this is that there has been a huge variation in rainfall pattern, and most parts of Africa have been experiencing shorter periods of rainfall and longer periods of dry season. The consequence of this has been a lot of drought and a lot of poor performance of our agricultural outputs. Another main area, but is the incidence of extreme weather events. And the third big area is through flooding. Africa is experiencing a lot of flooding, and that is resulting in massive displacement of people. In some cases, the entire states or communities have been sacked by flooding. And this also has resulted in serious socioeconomic consequences for many, many countries and communities across Africa. There are a range of different things that should be done. Number one, African countries need to fully understand the nature of impacts that are currently being experienced and the future projected impact. This means investing heavily in science, in climate modeling, climate prediction, to be able to understand the current and future dimensions of impact. So we need planning not only at national level, but also at subnational and local levels. And quite frankly, also, Africa needs to intensify their advocacy to attract finance, technology, and capacity building resources from the developed countries to enable them to implement their plan.
Still on climate matters, European Union leaders have reached a hard-fought deal to cut the bloc's greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by the end of this decade. Now, that target will replace its existing goal of cutting emissions by 40% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. Here's CGTN's Lucy Howe with the details from Brussels.
A sleepless night of marathon talks and a deal clinched just before breakfast. A new climate target finally got the green light, increasing the EU's emission reduction goal to 55% by 2030. For those spearheading the negotiations ahead of this weekend's UN climate summit, it was a relief.
The fact that we were able to commit, one day before the UN summit, to a joint European reduction target of 55% by 2030 is, in my view, a very important result. It was worth losing a night's sleep to achieve this. I don't want to imagine what would have happened if we hadn't been able to achieve such a result.
Member states were unable to agree on new climate targets back in October amid concern from countries such as Hungary and Poland over their economic impact. With Europe wanting to be seen as a world leader on climate change, finding compromise was vital.
It is a major signal and a concrete ambition. The European Union has shown that it will live up to its climate goals.
The night saw another breakthrough with a long sought-after deal on the EU's long-term budget and COVID recovery fund. The deal means badly needed funds can be made available from January. But when it comes to Brexit, there's continued uncertainty. EU leaders discussed the matter for just 10 minutes and were told that no deal is now the most likely scenario. It comes after a torrid week in the post-Brexit negotiations, with a visit from Prime Minister Boris Johnson to Brussels failing to bear fruit. Talks are stuck on fishing rights and the level playing field. The EU said that whilst it wants to ensure fair competition, the UK would still be able to go it alone.
This is not to say that we would require the UK to follow us every time we decide to raise our level of ambition, for example, in the environmental field. They would remain free, sovereign, if you wish, to decide what they want to do.
Both sides say a final decision on a trade agreement will come on Sunday night. But von der Leyen's use of the word sovereign in that statement might ease the deadlock. This was the last time EU leaders will meet before the holidays and marked a chance to tie up important issues ahead of the new year. But as the pandemic continues, and with a no-deal Brexit looming on the horizon, 2021 could offer yet more obstacles. Lucy Hoff, CGTN, Brussels.
You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. The Bank of England is warning of post-Brexit disruptions to financial services. And EU leaders finally agree on a $2.2 trillion stimulus package for the bloc's economies. The details coming up next.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself. If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back to the programme. Let's run through some of the stories making your headlines at this hour. Starting in Egypt, the country has received its first batch of a COVID-19 vaccine made by Chinese pharmaceutical firm Sinopharm. Egypt got that consignment on Thursday night. Now, the company in question has been collaborating with the UAE and Egypt in conducting phase 3 human clinical trials. Authorities in the United Arab Emirates approved the use of the Chinese vaccine within their territory. Those in Egypt gave it the green light for emergency use in the country as well. Over to Africa's largest copper exporter, lawmakers in the Democratic Republic of Congo have removed the Speaker of Parliament from office. Janine Mabunda was removed in a vote that went well into the night on Thursday. Her removal is being described as a major victory for President Felix Tshisekedi, who is on a mission to assert his authority after breaking up the ruling coalition that he jointly led with the man he succeeded in office, the former president Joseph Kabila. And over in North Africa, Washington says it's recognized Morocco's sovereignty over the territory of Western Sahara. This came following a call between the US President Donald Trump and the Moroccan King Mohammed VI. The Polisario Front, which fought Morocco for independence of Western Sahara, condemned Mr. Trump's statement. Since the 70s, that region has witnessed a deadlock. Morocco has also announced that it will normalize ties with Israel. It becomes the fourth since August to do so. That's a run through your headlines. Further afield now, the Bank of England said today that British banks are resilient in the face of Brexit. The central bank says most risks to the UK's financial stability have been largely mitigated through extensive preparations by the private sector. But it did add that some market volatility, especially with regard to EU-based clients, could arise at the end of the period. The BOE says its optimism in British banks is based on the fact that institutions are capable of absorbing at least £200 billion in credit losses. British banks already took a hit of roughly £20 billion sterling in credit losses this year alone as a result of the economic damage inflicted on the UK's economy by the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, prospects for a post-Brexit trade deal with the EU are looking slimmer and slimmer, and British retailers are warning that shoppers could face much higher food prices next year. That would come because new tariffs would be imposed if there's no formal trade agreement between the two sides. Britain's Brexit transition period ends at the end of December, the 31st of this month. And in the absence of a deal, the country will trade with the EU on WTO terms, meaning new tariffs. Prime Minister Boris Johnson said on Thursday there was a strong possibility that the UK would not secure a deal. The British Retail Consortium says without an agreement, supermarkets and shoppers will face over £3 billion in tariffs from 2021. All right, then let's get you the latest with what's going on in Brussels. Lucy Howard joins us now live from Brussels with more data on the story. So the UK Prime Minister told businesses to basically prepare for a no-deal exit. But what does that look like in real terms for manufacturers, for airlines, for logistics firms operating in the UK and trading across the channel with the EU?
Well, it looks like a huge shift and a lot of disruption for some weeks after January the 1st, which is the first day that a no-deal scenario would kick in. We're told that there could be long queues of lorries either side of the channel in France and in the UK as well, with new border checks at either side. There would be, as you were just outlining there, potentials for higher food prices and prices for things like fuel for consumers in the UK because of those tariffs that would be imposed under WTO terms. That goes as high as 35% for non-agricultural products. For things like cars, it's 10%, so a big spike. We're told that there could be some food shortages in the UK due to problems with transportation, some shortages of crucial medicines as well. Clearly not ideal as the mass vaccination programme in the UK starts to begin. So it is a worrying picture, but nonetheless one that Boris Johnson says the UK needn't be afraid of. He has repeated throughout the last few weeks that Britain would prosper mightily in a no-deal scenario, and it would allow the UK to sign trade deals with other nations later down the line because it would be free to diverge from EU rules. But nonetheless, we have heard some worrying things about what a no-deal scenario would look like in practice.
Let us assume, for the sake of argument, let's assume the UK does crash out without a deal come the end of December. Why are the EU's contingency exit plans, mostly covering fisheries and logistics, why are they particularly deemed to be unpalatable to the UK?
Well, it's a continuation of the status quo for some months to come. I mean, the basic arrangements that would be put in place to ensure some basic service for road transportation and aviation services as well would be in place for 6 months. Arrangements on fishing rights allowing EU fishermen access to UK waters would be in place for a year until a deal can be worked out. So the UK government would have to sell this at home, and it is essentially a continuation of what's in place at the moment. We had a fairly tepid statement from the UK when these contingency measures were posted yesterday afternoon, following that meeting between EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and her counterpart, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Hours after that meeting, the UK said that these are already plans that have been posted in 2019. They would be scrutinised in detail, but they were still continuing with the negotiations, but nonetheless would look at what the EU was presenting on offer. But yes, the plans so far have been unpalatable to the British government. Indeed, looking at the sterling dollar rate, it doesn't seem like currency markets have moved really that much. Given what we're seeing in the markets, is that December 13th deadline to essentially wrap up trade talks, is that cast in stone, or is there a good chance it might be moved forward yet again? There's a high chance that it will be moved forward yet again. I mean, we're told that this is a day that a decision will be made. It is not a hard deadline. We are told that there will be a sense of whether the talks have a future, if indeed the talks can continue with those key issues of fishing rights and the level playing field, rules on fair competition, if the two negotiating teams can identify a pathway to try and grapple with those issues and try and get a resolution before the December the 31st deadline, with the UK government categorically ruling out that the talks will continue into next year. So Sunday is likely to be decisive as to whether or not the two teams will continue their work. It is seeming unlikely at that point that a deal will be announced. What is probable or possible is that a no-deal scenario will be announced at that point. The two teams feel they can go no further in these long and complex negotiations. Indeed, certainly sounds like we're going to have a very interesting weekend. Lucy Howe in Brussels, thank you very much. Now, after a weeks-long blockade by Hungary and Poland, leaders of the EU have finally agreed to a much-needed stimulus package. It's hoped that this will help bring the bloc, the 27-member countries, back from the edge of an economic cliff. But as CGTN's Tony Waterman now explains from Brussels, this one standoff has been put to bed, but another one just won't go away.
Finally, a bit of good news for Brussels. After weeks of uncertainty, EU leaders have clinched a deal to unlock a historic $2.2 trillion budget and COVID recovery package, paving the way for funds to start flowing to pandemic-battered economies. European Council President Charles Michel said in a tweet, "Now we can start with the implementation and build back our economies." The spending package was first agreed to in July, but Hungary and Poland threatened to torpedo the agreement after a new mechanism linking EU funds to upholding democracy was introduced, outraging the remaining 25 member states eager to kickstart a pandemic recovery. Under the deal, the mechanism remains, but the European Court of Justice will have the last say on any alleged breaches, ultimately delaying penalties. EU leaders also signed off on a list of priorities for a reset in the transatlantic relationship once U.S. President-elect Joe Biden takes office on January 20th. But hanging like a dark cloud over the council building, Brexit, only added to the official agenda at the 11th hour. Leaders meeting as UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson told Britons to prepare for a no deal.
There's now a strong possibility that we will have a solution that's much more like an Australian relationship with the EU.
An Australian-style deal, code for no deal at all, with trade reverting to World Trade Organization rules, tariffs and quotas returning for the first time in decades. Johnson's warning came just hours after Brussels fired off contingency plans of its own to keep planes flying and trucks hauling if both sides fail to strike a deal by the end of the year.
We are willing to grant access to the single market to our British friends. It's the largest single market in the world, but the conditions have to be fair.
The Brexit chief negotiators were back around the table on Thursday, trying to punch through a weeks-long stalemate on other outstanding issues.
The new deadline for trade talks is now Sunday, when Brussels and Downing Street will assess what progress has been made and decide what steps to take next. Time, though, is running out to clinch a deal with just 3 weeks left before the Brexit transition period expires, ushering in a whole new EU-UK relationship, trade deal or not. Tony Waterman, CGTN, Brussels.
In New York, the months of the COVID-19 pandemic have meant nothing but change for the city's restaurants and bars. From small family-owned restaurants to famous large establishments, all of them have had to deal with limits to what kind of service they can offer, how many people can be seated inside, and when indoor dining is allowed to return, and even how to adjust to the rise of outdoor dining. That roller coaster of change is still continuing, as CGTN's Noel Mokugu now reports.
The restaurant industry is essential to New York City's social and economic fabric. From small family-owned restaurants and food carts to four-star world-famous establishments, the city abounds with the restaurants that offer cuisines from every corner of the globe. Today, however, the industry has taken one of its heaviest blows due to COVID-19 pandemic.
When it started in March, we had 4 restaurants open and running, and one that was fairly new opened in fall. And then I had a bar that was open for 20 years. Both those places have closed. We tried to keep them open. The small little restaurant that we opened on 4th Avenue called Guero's was doing great. Would have just gotten to spring. It's tacos and margaritas, and would have done really well. So we tried to stay open.
Although the COVID-19 vaccine rollout could begin any day, it will not have arrived soon enough to save thousands of struggling restaurant and bar owners like Wade Hagenbat. Having been forced to permanently close 2 of the Brooklyn restaurants he co-owns due to the plummeting business, Hagenbat and his staff are doing all they can to hang on.
It's winter, so it's a little slower for margaritas and tacos, but it does pretty well for right now. So we're going to leave that open, and that's going to be what we're going to do through the winter. And our other bar, Dram Shop, we ended up just closing. We used PPP money as much as we could, and then once that was extinguished again, we decided to close. And now we're just really just trying to do like little private parties for 9 to 18 people to watch a football game or whatnot until this pandemic is over, and then we can maybe reopen.
According to the National Restaurants Association, over 110,000 restaurants in the U.S. have had to close either permanently or long-term since the pandemic began. An additional 500,000 are still struggling.
The federal government did the best they could at the beginning. I think they're dropping the ball now, or they didn't carry on with the unemployment insurance, and I think that is going to hurt a lot of people. The PPP money was great at the beginning, but then after you realize how long this is lasting, they would have had to provide 10 times as much as they provided.
The latest U.S. unemployment figures coincide with a surging viral outbreak that appears to be weakening the job market and the economy. The number of people applying for unemployment aid jumped last week to 853,000. That's the highest since September. At the same time, the total number of people who are receiving state-provided unemployment aid rose for the first time in 3 months to 5.8 million from 5.5 million. Well over 19 million others are depending on government aid. Experts say unless the government acts soon, nearly half of them will lose that aid in just 2 weeks. Noel Mokugu, CGTN.
Quick run through the commodity prices for you. In a sign of just how this pandemic has absolutely savaged air travel, consider the case of Heathrow, one of the top 10 busiest airports in the world, 7th, I believe, according to 2019 traffic data. It's seen passenger traffic fall by 88% in the month of November. It will actually keep Terminal 4 closed until the end of next year. Brent surged past $50 a barrel, didn't have a massive head of steam behind it. February futures down about half a percentage point lower at 14.19 GMT, $50.02 a barrel. It did fall back under that a little later in the day. Copper contracts in London 2% higher, $7,878 a ton, but they did fall back later again in the day after hitting levels not seen since the first quarter of 2013, according to Bloomberg data. Here's what's coming up next. And the final part of the bulletin will bring you a taste of the most expensive spice in the world when we return.
Don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
My family has been doing this artwork for the past 600 years.
My dream is to be the leading player in Africa in spice sector.
Nobody in the region consumes it. Even me cannot afford the vanilla cooking.
What we've created here is the elegance, the color, the celebration of life.
Welcome back. We're all familiar with saffron, right? It's a lovely spice used in foods, colouring, medicine, even perfumes. And it's the most expensive spice on the planet. At the moment, Morocco is the top producer of saffron in Africa. The country produces roughly 7 tons of it every single year. And over 90% of that valuable spice is calculated in just one region, which is at the heart of the industry.
الزعفران هو حاجة أساسية في المنطقة، هو المنتوج الوحيد اللي كتعتمد فيه الناس ديال المنطقة، هو الأساس ديالهم فاش كيعتمدوا عليه سنويا. سميتي محمد أزرقي، من مواليد ديال 1989 في دوار إغري، جماعة سيدي حسين، دائرة ديال تاليوين، عملة تارودانس. أنا دخلت في الميدان في 2013 حيت الأصل ديال جدودي من كيديروا ديك الفلاحة ديال الزعفران، وبديت كنعاون الوالد في المنتوج ديالو، كيفاش كيتغرس، كيفاش كيحرثو، كيفاش كيتسقى. من ديك الساعات أنا خدام فيه، كنتعلمو شوية بشوية. ملي كيبداو الموسم ديال الزعفران تقريبا كنخدموا ما بين 15 حتى 30 واحد. الزعفران كنحرثوه كنزرعوه في شتنبر، وكيتسقى في الاول ديال اكتوبر. الجو اللي كيبغي الزعفران كيبغي الجو يكون بارد، الارتفاع، البلاصه اللي فيها الارتفاع كيكون فيها البرد اقل من 7 دوغري درجات، والماء كيبغيه تقريبا على الاقل مره في 20 يوم. كنجمعوا مره واحده في شهر اكتوبر، مره واحده في العام صافي. مرحبا بكم عندنا، مرحبا بكم. احنا بدينا كنقيو الزعفران كنقادو فيه، فاش جبناه في الجنان جمعنا كامل في الجنان، حنا جبناه للدار بدينا كنقيو. كيفاش كنقيو عاوتاني كيتنقى وحده بوحده كيما كيتجمع في الجنان، كيما كيتجمع في الجنان كيتنقى عاوتاني وحده بوحده بحال. والعيالات بزاف اللي كيخدموا هاد الخدمه هما اللي كيخدموها. وملي كنقيوه عاوتاني كنزيدو فيه النقه اللي الا فيه شي زبال ولا طاحت فيه شي طرف ديال شي وريضه ولا شي حاجه بيضاء كتحيل، كيتنقص ليه الجدر شويه، كنقصوا ليه الجدر باش ما يخسرش الكولور ديالو إلا نشف. وملي كنساليو كيتنقى كيتقاد كنديوه لو شوشوار. انا كنخدم لو شوشوار بزاف هكا كنقادو في الشوشوار باش ينشف وباش تبقى لا كاليتي كيما هي. حيت كاين اللي كينشفو في الظل كاين اللي كيديروا في الظل ولكن الظل كيشد الوقت شويه بزاف والمشكل كتكون فيه الغبره ولا دوز شي حشره ودوز فوق منه حيت الزعفران حساس بزاف. ملي كنقادوه في الشوشوار تقريبا كنريقلو على الوقيته فاش بغينا.
السلام عليكم. أزول 30 هجر. لاج ولا السن 19 سنة. تعلمنا تقريبا ديك بين 9 سنين 10 سنين كنا غير كنمشيو معاهم للجنان كنشوفو ما كنحيدوش غير كنشوفو كيفاش كيحيدوا. مرة كنحيدوهم مرة لا كنعرفش لاج باقيين صغار. ولكن فاش كنجيو للدار كنجلسو المهم تاني كنشوف فيهم. ولكن فاش تعلمناني تقريبا بين ديك 12 13 هكاك.
دابا الزعفران نشف بس نفيريفو نعرفو كيف داير ياك ما فيه شي حاجه ولا نقادو كامل ونشوفو الريحه ديالو هي هذيك. حتى اللون حتى هو بقى كيما هو في الاول. غندوقو اللوغو ديالو ياك ما تحرق ولا شي حاجه هو هذاك صافي. دابا عندنا هذا هو الزعفران راه دابا موجود للماكله. السلام عليكم. الفوائد ديال الزعفران كيصلح للبرد كيصلح للتجميل بحال الوجه الشعر كيصلح للبصر حتى هو للعينين. الحاجه الاخرى كاين اللي كيديروا على حسب الشرايين ديال القلب اللي كيحل الشرايين ديال القلب الى مسدودين ولا شي حاجه. ولكن ما تكثرش منه. الا كثرتي منه راه كيجري الدم بزاف حتى الانسان يقدر يمشي للغيبوبه.
Brief run through some currencies as we wrap up the programme for the week. The IMF is forecasting a pretty weak recovery in Nigeria in 2021, just 1.5%. That came out at its end of Article 4 mission statement in the country. Now, inflation is also forecast to remain well into the double digits above the central bank's target. Once again, the IMF is calling on Nigeria to make broad exchange rate reforms and to lay the foundation for raising a lot more domestic taxes. Further cuts in the policy rate, according to the IMF, are, and I quote them here, unlikely to provide additional support to Africa's largest economy. That's how we wrap up this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen on the programme. There are many ways to get your feedback back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour.